A millionaire disguises himself as a beggar to avenge the betrayal of his ex-wife and best friend, who took everything from him. Will he be able to carry out his revenge and recover what he lost? I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. James Johnson stood in the center of his imposing mansion, surrounded by warm lights that reflected the luxury he had built his life around. That night's gathering was crucial. Key investors, shareholders, and partners were there to celebrate the international expansion of his luxury hotel chain. Yet, amidst the chatter and laughter, James couldn't shake off a sense of unease, as if the night harbored a darker purpose. Davies, his best friend since college, raised a champagne glass, capturing everyone's attention. A toast to James Johnson, the man who turned an impossible dream into a reality that inspires everyone around him. To his success and everything that lies ahead. Davies's words echoed with enthusiasm, but there was something different in his tone. James knew him too well. That look wasn't one of admiration, but something more calculated. Lauren, his wife, stood beside Davies, softly laughing as her fingers brushed against Davies's arm. It was a subtle gesture, almost imperceptible, but James saw it. His stomach tightened. He decided to ignore it, convinced his mind was playing tricks on him. However, his intuition whispered otherwise. That intuition, honed through years of negotiations and corporate battles, was now warning him. The evening continued. James excused himself and went up to the study to review some documents. While going over a contract Davies had handed him days earlier, one particular clause caught his attention. It allowed changes to the company's power structure under certain conditions. Something didn't add up. He picked up his phone to call his lawyer, but stopped when he heard footsteps in the hallway. It was Lauren, laughing with someone. James turned off the study lights and slightly opened the door. From the shadows, he watched Lauren and Davies step onto the balcony, their voices low but audible. "He doesn't suspect a thing, Davies," Lauren said, smiling in a way James had never seen before. "I know, but we have to be careful. We need him to sign those papers tomorrow. Once he does, the company will be ours, and he'll be out for good." Lauren laughed softly, placing a hand on Davies' shoulder. "I never imagined it would be this easy. I always thought James was smarter." Each word was a direct blow to James's heart. He wanted to storm onto the balcony and confront them, but he held back. Instead, he quietly closed the door and returned to the study. His mind raced. How could they betray him like this? Lauren, the woman he had shared 10 years of his life with, and Davies, the man he considered a brother. He went back to his desk and opened a drawer, searching for something to distract himself while processing what he had just heard. That's when he found an envelope he didn't remember storing. Inside was a list of names and monetary amounts. Beside each name were small marks he couldn't decipher. The envelope bore the logo of a company Davies had worked with years ago. James felt a spark of curiosity mixed with fury. There was more at play, something beyond personal betrayal. The next morning arrived with a chill that mirrored James's mood. He feigned normalcy as he had breakfast with Lauren and Davies, who chatted animatedly about a meeting with shareholders that afternoon. James silently observed their every move, every expression. He had become a spectator in his own life. When the time came for the meeting, he signed the documents they presented. He knew it was a trap, but he had a plan. He needed them to think they had one. Davies shook his hand with a victorious smile, while Lauren hugged him with a sweetness he now knew was fake. James showed no emotion, but inside, he was seething. That night, he returned to the mansion to gather his belongings. The company's lawyers had informed him that, under the terms of the contract, he had to vacate the property immediately. As he packed in silence, he found an old photograph of his parents, a reminder of the days when they barely had enough to survive. James remembered his father's words, "Never let anyone make you feel small, son. Respect is earned, not bought." With that phrase resonating in his mind, James made a decision. He wouldn't let Davies and Lauren destroy what he had built, but he wouldn't fight them as the successful businessman everyone knew. If they had played dirty, he would do the same, but on his own terms. That same night, he burned his designer suits and threw his luxury watch into the river. He cut his hair in front of the mirror in the small apartment he had bought years ago, watching as his reflection changed. He was no longer James Johnson, the tycoon. Now he was Wilson, a homeless man ready to dive into the shadows to unravel the secrets of those who betrayed him. In the following days, James began observing from the shadows, tracking Davies and Lauren's every move. One night, while they celebrated at a luxurious restaurant, he overheard a conversation that caught his attention. "Do you think anyone suspects Operation Legacy?" Davies asked in a low voice. "Not if we follow the steps as planned," Lauren replied. "Everything will be secured before anyone can figure it out." James clenched his fists, knowing he had just found the first piece of the puzzle. Before we continue with the story, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. James, now under his new identity as Wilson, sat on a park bench across from what used to be his company. Dressed in old, dirty clothes and wearing a cap that concealed much of his face, he watched the building with a mix of nostalgia and rage. Minutes passed before Davies appeared at the entrance, surrounded by assistants and speaking animatedly on the phone. Davies looked confident, almost untouchable, which only fueled James's determination. For weeks, James had carefully planned every detail of his new life. His goal was to infiltrate the streets near his former company and gather every bit of information he could about Davies and Lauren. He wanted to be invisible to them, a shadow picking up every fragment they might let slip. And though the drastic lifestyle change was challenging, James found himself surprisingly comfortable in his new role. For the first time in years, he wasn't living up to anyone's expectations but his own. The day began with a scene that tested his patience. From the corner of the street, he watched as Davies got into his luxurious car. Before Davies could drive off, a man in a suit hurried over, handing him a brown envelope. Davies took it with visible urgency, glancing around as if afraid of being seen. He then placed the envelope in his briefcase and drove away. James couldn't hear what they said, but the exchange intrigued him. He knew he couldn't act impulsively. He needed more information. He moved to a small restaurant across the street, a place where he knew several employees from the company often ate lunch. Entering cautiously, he chose a table near the door where he could listen to conversations without drawing attention. As he pretended to study the cheap menu, he caught fragments of a conversation between two men seated nearby. "I can't believe Davies keeps getting away with this. Do you know how much money he's pulled from the accounts over the past few months? The guy's untouchable. If anyone found out, it could ruin him, but I doubt that'll happen. He's too well covered." James clenched his teeth as he listened. Davies hadn't just betrayed his friendship, but was also running the company corruptly. This was bigger than James had initially imagined. He decided he needed to get closer to the employees, especially those who seemed resentful of Davies. He knew that in places like this restaurant, people often said too much when they felt comfortable. As he left, he encountered Margaret, a young waitress who seemed to be having a rough day. He saw her arguing with a customer who was clearly treating her poorly. "If you can't even serve a plate properly, why are you working here?" the man said disdainfully. Margaret barely held back tears as she apologized. Feeling an unexpected sense of empathy, James approached her after the man left. "You shouldn't let someone like that talk to you that way," James said, his voice low but firm. Margaret looked at him, surprised. "What do you know? This job is all I have. If I lose it, I don't know what I'll do." James stayed calm. "Sometimes losing something is the best thing that can happen to you. Trust me, I speak from experience." The conversation was brief, but enough for James to notice that Margaret had a strong spirit despite being trapped in a tough situation. He decided she could be a valuable ally, someone who might help him get closer to Davies' inner circles without raising suspicion. That night, while sleeping in a homeless shelter, James overheard two men talking in a corner of the dormitory. One of them, visibly drunk, mentioned a place called La Bodega, which they used for clandestine meetings involving shady business deals. James pretended to be asleep, but mentally recorded every word. This could be his next lead. The next morning, James headed to the address he had overheard. La Bodega turned out to be a dimly lit bar in a secluded alley. He entered cautiously, feeling the stares of the few customers inside. He sat at the bar and ordered a cheap coffee, observing the place. Minutes later, Davies entered with an older man who seemed nervous. From his position, James couldn't hear the entire conversation, but the bits he managed to catch were enough to unsettle him. "The money will arrive this week. But I need you to move it quickly, Davies said in an authoritative tone. The risk is too high. If anyone finds out, this will all go to hell, the man responded, almost whispering. That's why you have me. No one suspects anything, and as long as Lauren does her part, we'll be covered. James felt his heart race. Everything indicated that Davies was involved in something far bigger than a simple corporate betrayal. Mentions of money, risks, and Lauren's involvement pointed to a dangerous game that could affect many lives. He decided to follow Davies as he left the bar, observing him from a distance and mentally noting every place he went. Then something unexpected happened. A man in a dark jacket approached him from behind. You shouldn't be here, James, the man whispered, pausing only for a second before walking away. James froze. How did he know his name? No one was supposed to recognize him in his beggar disguise. He looked around, but the man had already disappeared into the crowd. His heart pounded as he processed what had just happened. Someone was watching him, someone who knew who he really was. This not only complicated his plan, but also put him in danger. That night, back at the shelter, he found a note slipped under his bed. Opening it, he read words that made him clench his fists. If you keep going, you'll regret it. James tore the paper into pieces, but his resolve only grew stronger. He wasn't just up against Davies and Lauren anymore. He was facing an unknown enemy who seemed to be watching him from the shadows. The dawn brought a mix of determination and distrust for James, now known as Wilson. Although the mysterious man's warning the night before had put him on edge, his resolve to continue with his plan for revenge remained unshaken. He knew he couldn't afford to be discovered, but he also couldn't abandon the mission he had started. Davies and Lauren's world of deceit and corruption had to crumble. As the first rays of sunlight illuminated the streets, James returned to the restaurant where he had met Margaret. Pretending to be looking for work, he asked her if she knew of any temporary job opportunities. Grateful for the way he had defended her the previous day, Margaret offered to help. I can ask the manager here, she said while cleaning a table. Even if it doesn't pay much, at least it's something to start with. James nodded with a faint smile. Anything helps. Thank you for trying to help me, Margaret. She looked at him curiously. Where are you from, Wilson? You don't seem like someone who's been on the streets all your life. James lowered his gaze, as if recalling something painful. Let's just say things changed for me. Now I'm trying to start over. The conversation was brief, but enough to begin building Margaret's trust in him. In turn, James saw her as a unique opportunity. Margaret knew several employees from Davies' company, a connection that could be crucial for gathering information without raising suspicion. Later that day, James started working as a kitchen helper in the restaurant. Although the conditions were precarious, the place turned out to be a goldmine for his investigation. Employees who came to eat often spoke openly about the internal problems of the company, and James listened intently to every word. Did you see the email Davies sent? One employee asked another as they ate lunch. It's obvious he's hiding something. The company doesn't have any liquidity, and they're asking us to act like everything's fine. The other man scoffed indignantly. What do you expect? Davies is just covering his own ass. But if this keeps up, we'll all end up on the street. James mentally noted every detail. Davies wasn't just betraying him personally. He was also driving the company into ruin and jeopardizing the employees who depended on him. James's anger grew, but he knew he needed more evidence to expose him. That night, James decided to take a bold step. Using addresses he had collected in his notebook, he went to one of the buildings where Davies often met with his associates. Pretending to be a homeless man looking for food, he positioned himself near the entrance and waited. His patience paid off when he saw Davies enter the building with a briefcase. James got up and, feigning a stumble, positioned himself close enough to overhear part of his conversation with another man. Everything is ready for the transfer, Davies said in a low voice. But you need to make sure there's no trace. I can't risk this leading back to me. The other man looked around nervously. I'll do it, but it's going to cost extra. Davies clenched his teeth. I've already paid you more than you're worth. Do your job, or I'll find someone else. James quickly moved away before being noticed. Although he hadn't caught all the details, he knew he was onto something big. Davies was involved in a corruption scheme that went far beyond the company. It was clear that Davies's actions weren't just driven by greed. They were fueled by fear of being exposed. The next morning, Margaret offered him a cup of coffee as they prepared the restaurant's kitchen. She noticed that James seemed more serious than usual. "Are you okay, Wilson?" she asked with genuine concern. James looked up, trying to appear calm. "I've just been thinking about how powerful people always seem to get away with everything. I wonder if things will ever change." Margaret sighed. "I know what you mean. I've seen how they treat the employees at that company. Lauren and Davies act like they're untouchable." James frowned. "Lauren? What do you know about her?" Margaret hesitated for a moment, but then decided to speak. "Lauren used to come here a few months ago. She always demanded the best service, but never left a tip. One time, she got a friend of mine fired just because he messed up her order. I don't know how someone can be so cruel." Margaret's words confirmed what James already suspected. Lauren was no longer the woman he had loved. Her transformation into a ruthless and selfish person seemed complete. However, James also knew that revenge alone wouldn't be enough. He had to expose the truth about both Davies and Lauren. That same night, James decided to infiltrate Davies's office. He had overheard that the building had no security after 10 o'clock, and he seized the opportunity. Dressed in his worn-out clothes, he climbed a fence and entered through a slightly open back window. Although he knew the risk was high, the adrenaline drove him forward. Inside the office, he began searching through documents for anything incriminating. After a few minutes, he found an envelope containing several papers. One was a contract with figures that didn't add up, indicating that Davies was funneling funds into an offshore account. Another was a record of bank transfers with names James didn't recognize but were clearly connected to Davies's corruption. Suddenly, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned off his flashlight and hid behind a piece of furniture. From his hiding spot, he saw Davies enter the office with another man. "Do you have the report?" Davies asked, visibly tense. "Of course, but there's a problem," the man replied. "Someone's asking too many questions. If we don't act quickly, we could be in trouble." Davies cursed under his breath. "Then make sure they stay quiet. I don't want any more surprises." James held his breath as the men left. Once the coast was clear, he took photos of the documents as evidence and exited the building unnoticed. Exhausted but satisfied, he knew he had taken a crucial step in his plan. The next day, James met Margaret at a nearby park. As they talked, Margaret mentioned something that caught his attention. "I heard Davies is planning a big party at his mansion this weekend. It looks like he wants to impress some important partners." James smiled faintly. Maybe it's the perfect time for a surprise. James, still living under the guise of Wilson, walked through the streets with the determination of a man who had reached a point of no return. The information he had gathered the previous night was enough to take the first step in his plan for revenge. The evidence of Davies's embezzlement and the names listed in the documents not only proved his corruption but also implicated other powerful figures backing his schemes. The challenge wasn't just to bring Davies down, but to ensure that his downfall would echo throughout the network he had built. James understood that any misstep could expose him, but he also realized that this was the perfect time to strike back. 2 nights later, James, dressed as Wilson, arrived in the city's most exclusive neighborhood, where Davies was hosting a luxurious party at a mansion that now belonged to him. Under the warm glow of garden lights, laughter and the clinking of glasses filled the air, painting a picture of opulence and superficiality. However, James noticed something else. There was a lack of genuine joy in the conversations. It was clear that the company was in trouble, and Davies was desperately trying to convince his guests otherwise. From a safe distance, James watched as Lauren, stunning in a red dress, moved among the guests with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The dissatisfaction on her face confirmed what Margaret had told him. Lauren's glamorous life was nothing but an illusion. James waited for his moment, hidden among the bushes near the back garden. He had planned his entry meticulously. Taking advantage of a brief lapse in the security team's vigilance, he slipped through a side entrance. In his backpack was a USB drive containing incriminating evidence of Davies's embezzlement. His plan was simple yet effective. Infiltrate Davies's personal office and upload the files to his computer. The mansion's interior was even more lavish than its exterior. James passed through a hallway adorned with paintings by renowned artists, each worth more than any employee of the company could earn in years. The irony hit him hard. While Davies squandered money on luxury, his employees struggled to make ends meet. Reaching the office, James moved quickly. He inserted the USB drive into the computer and uploaded the files while skimming through other documents for additional evidence. He found records of bank transfers, falsified invoices, and manipulated contracts. Each piece fit perfectly into the puzzle of Davies' corruption. Just as he was finishing copying everything, he heard voices approaching. Quickly, he turned off the computer, hid the papers in a drawer, and crouched behind a sofa. The door opened, and Davies entered with an unfamiliar man. "This can't go on, Davies," said the man, his tone filled with worry. "The shareholders are starting to get suspicious. If we don't secure a new contract soon, everything will collapse." Davies ran a hand through his hair, visibly irritated. "Do you think I don't know that? I'm doing everything I can to keep up appearances. That contract with the international consortium is our only way out." The man sighed, lowering his voice. "And what if it doesn't work? We can't rely solely on that. Besides, someone's been talking too much. I've heard rumors that someone inside the company is investigating your moves." Davies clenched his fists. "Leave that to me. If I find out who it is, I'll make sure they never speak again." James held his breath as the two men left the office. He knew his plan was working, but Davies' growing suspicion was a dangerous sign. He needed to act quickly before things escalated further. The next day, James, with the help of an anonymous contact he had cultivated during his time as a businessman, sent an email to the international consortium containing evidence of Davies' fraud. He included details about offshore accounts and manipulated contracts, exposing the magnitude of the irregularities. He knew this would not only jeopardize the contract but also begin to tarnish Davies' reputation. That afternoon, while working at the restaurant, James overheard two employees discussing the aftermath of the previous night's party. "Did you hear what happened this morning?" one of them asked. "The consortium canceled the contract with Davies' company. They said they received information about financial fraud." The other man laughed in disbelief. "It was only a matter of time. That guy can't keep fooling everyone forever." James showed no reaction, but inside, he felt a mix of satisfaction and anticipation. The first blow had been struck, and the effects were beginning to show. However, he knew Davies wouldn't sit idly by. That evening, as James rested in the small room Margaret had offered him, he received a message from an unknown number. When he opened it, a chill ran down his spine. "I know who you are, James. You're playing with fire." The message included a photo of him entering the company building disguised as Wilson. Someone had been watching him and now knew his secret. James turned off the phone, taking deep breaths to calm himself. He couldn't let fear stop him. He had come too far to turn back now. The next morning, Margaret noticed that James was quieter than usual. While they prepared breakfast in the restaurant's kitchen, she decided to speak with him. "Wilson, you seem worried. Did something happen?" James shook his head, making an effort to maintain his facade. "I'm just thinking about how to move forward. Sometimes it feels like the past always finds a way to catch up with you." Margaret nodded empathetically. "We all have something that haunts us, but sometimes facing it is the only way to move forward." Her words resonated with James, who knew that the confrontation with Davies was drawing closer. Although the risk was greater than ever, so was his determination to see justice served. James knew that targeting the international consortium had been a risky but necessary move. However, the anonymous message he received the night before kept echoing in his mind. Someone had discovered his true identity, putting not only his plan but also those around him, like Margaret, in danger. Despite the risks, James couldn't stop now. His next step was to publicly expose Davies, but doing so without revealing himself required precision and an unshakable resolve. During his next shift at the restaurant, James observed Margaret as she served customers with her usual genuine smile. She had become a constant in his new life, a reminder that not everything was lost. But now, he feared that their connection could turn her into a target. As he washed dishes, Margaret approached him with a frown. "Wilson, someone left this for you outside." It was a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside, James found a single sheet of paper with a message. "We know what you're doing. If you continue, there will be consequences." Alongside the note was a photograph of Margaret serving tables. James felt his stomach tighten. He glanced at Margaret, who was looking at him with curiosity. "Is everything okay, Wilson?" she asked. James took a deep breath and tucked the letter into his pocket. "Yeah, just some annoying advertisement. Nothing important." He tried to appear calm, but he knew now that he was up against a far more dangerous enemy than he had anticipated. That afternoon, James returned to his former company, still disguised as Wilson. He stayed in the shadows, observing the steady flow of employees entering and exiting the building. Through a second-floor window, he caught a glimpse of Davies in his office, arguing with someone on the phone. Determined to gather more information, James waited until nightfall to sneak back into the building. This time, his goal was to collect evidence linking Davies not just to embezzlement, but also to his connections with other corrupt business figures. Once inside, James reached the server room, where he had previously planted a device to hack into Davies' emails. As he waited for the files to download, he noticed someone else was in the building. The lights in Davies' office were still on, and voices echoed down the hallway. Moving cautiously, James hid behind a wall and listened. "I told you I'd handle this, Lauren. You don't need to get involved," Davies said. Lauren's voice was tense. "Handle it? Everything is falling apart. Davies, we lost the contract, the shareholders are furious, and now you're talking about shutting down branches. What do you expect me to do? Sit back while you ruin everything?" Davies sighed, exasperated. "Lauren, don't forget how you got here. This is as much your fault as it is mine. If anyone finds out what we did, I won't be the only one paying the price." James clenched his fists as he heard those words. Lauren wasn't just complicit in Davies' crimes. She had been an active participant in betraying him. Though he had suspected it, hearing it so clearly reignited his anger. However, it also became evident that their relationship was on the verge of collapse, which could be an advantage for him. The next day, James put his next move into action. He met with an independent journalist named Andres, known for his fearlessness in exposing corruption. Posing as an anonymous informant, James handed him the evidence of Davies' financial crimes, including the offshore accounts and the names of other implicated individuals. Initially skeptical, Andres was convinced by the weight of the documents. "This is explosive, but also dangerous. Are you sure you want me to publish this?" Andres asked. James looked at him firmly. "People need to know the truth, but make sure to protect your source. If something goes wrong, it'll all fall on me." Andres nodded, promising to be cautious. James knew the clock was ticking. Once the story broke, there would be no turning back. That evening, while reviewing the files downloaded from Davies' emails, James stumbled upon something that left him frozen. One of the offshore accounts was registered under a name he hadn't expected, Lauren. The account's creation date matched the months leading up to her betrayal. It was clear that Lauren had been planning her escape long before James discovered her infidelity. This not only strengthened his resolve for revenge, but also confirmed that she had always been willing to betray him for her own gain. The publication of Andres' report had an immediate impact. By the next day, Davies' company became the center of a media storm. Shareholders began withdrawing their support, the stock prices plummeted, and authorities announced a formal investigation. Davies' face appeared in headlines as the symbol of corporate corruption, and rumors of his potential arrest began circulating. Meanwhile, Lauren struggled to maintain her composure, but the pressure was evident. In a desperate attempt to protect herself, she hired a private investigator to find out who was behind everything. The investigator began following Davies and those close to him, but also noticed something peculiar: a homeless man who always seemed to be nearby during Davies' movements. That night, as James returned to Margaret's room, he noticed someone following him. Quickening his pace, he turned into an alley to lose his pursuer. But as he rounded a corner, the man caught up to him and shoved him against the wall. "You think you can play this game and come out clean, don't you?" James tried to break free, but the man held him firmly. "We know who you are, and we're not going to let you ruin everything." Before James could respond, the man released him and disappeared into the darkness, leaving him with more questions than answers. James now faced not only Davies and Lauren, but also an unknown enemy determined to protect the corrupt network. Back at the room, Margaret greeted him with concern. "Wilson, are you okay? You look terrible." James forced a smile. "Just a bad day. Don't worry, everything will be fine." Margaret didn't seem convinced, but decided not to press further. As she left, James gazed out the window at the city lights. He knew the stakes were higher than ever, but he was closer than ever to bringing down Davies and Lauren. The media scandal had shaken the foundations of the company that once belonged to James. Davies was in the eye of the storm, his face plastered across headlines as his reputation crumbled before the nation. The pressure was unbearable, and Lauren fared no better. Though she tried to maintain her facade of perfection, the cracks in her world were becoming more apparent. What they didn't know was that James was behind it all, watching as their lives unraveled while preparing his next move. Sitting on a bench in the plaza across from the company, James, still disguised as Wilson, observed employees leaving the building with boxes in hand, victims of Davies' desperate cost-cutting measures. Every time someone mentioned Davies' name, it was accompanied by insults or sarcastic laughter. James felt a mix of satisfaction and anger. Satisfaction because his plan was working, and anger because it wasn't over yet. He needed more. He wanted to see them directly face the consequences of their actions. That night, as he reviewed Davies' financial movements on his laptop, James discovered a suspicious transfer to an account under the name Thomas Santoro. The name was unfamiliar, but the amounts involved were too large to ignore. He decided to investigate further. If Davies was working with someone more powerful, James needed to uncover who it was and their role in everything. Meanwhile, Lauren, growing increasingly paranoid, continued searching for clues about who was sabotaging them. She had hired a private investigator who not only followed Davies but also observed those in his orbit. One night, as she reviewed the reports sent by the investigator, she found a photograph of a man who vaguely resembled James, though dressed in worn clothing and with a disheveled appearance. The possibility made her laugh bitterly. James as a beggar? He'd never sink that low, she muttered, tossing the report aside. Yet, a small seed of doubt was planted in her mind. At the same time, Davies faced more serious challenges. In an impromptu meeting with the few remaining shareholders, he tried to convince them that everything was under control, but the nervousness in his voice was evident. One of the men present, an investor named Salvador, stood up and confronted him directly. "Why should we trust you, Davies? This entire disaster is because of your decisions. What guarantees do we have that you won't sink us further?" Davies clenched his fists, struggling to keep his composure. "I have a plan to recover the lost investments. I just need time to implement it." Another investor laughed sarcastically. "Time is what we don't have. If you don't fix this within a week, we'll be forced to sell our shares to the competition." The words hung in the air, leaving Davies visibly shaken. When the meeting ended, he locked himself in his office and, in a fit of rage, threw his phone against the wall. What he didn't know was that James had been watching everything through a hidden camera he had previously installed in the office. While Davies and Lauren struggled to maintain control, James decided it was time to confront Lauren directly. Posing as an anonymous informant, he contacted her under the pretense of having information about Davies' activities. He invited her to a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city, assuring her it was a safe place to talk. Lauren arrived on time, wearing an elegant coat that contrasted sharply with the modest cafe. When James saw her enter, he felt a mix of nostalgia and contempt. It was the first time he had been so close to her since her betrayal, but he knew he couldn't afford to waver. Lauren sat across from him, frowning. "What do you know about Davies? Why did you want to meet me?" James kept his tone calm. "I know he's siphoning money and planning to abandon you. If you're not careful, you'll end up just like me." Lauren looked at him suspiciously, but his words seemed to strike a chord. "Who are you? Why are you helping me?" James smirked slightly, keeping his face hidden under the hood. "Let's just say someone like you taught me not to trust anyone. This is just a reminder to watch your back." Before Lauren could respond, James stood up and left the cafe, leaving her with more questions than answers. That same night, Davies confronted Lauren after discovering she had withdrawn a significant amount of money from one of their joint accounts. The argument was heated, with both hurling accusations at each other. "You think I don't know what you're doing, Davies? You're a fraud, and everyone knows it." Davies stepped closer, pointing a finger at her. "Don't you dare talk to me like that. If it weren't for me, you'd be on the streets. I'm the one who gave you everything." Lauren laughed bitterly. "Do you really think I need you? James was 10 times the man you are. At least he didn't lie about every damn detail." Lauren's words stung Davies more than he was willing to admit. Instead of responding, he stormed out, leaving her alone in the living room. James, who had installed another hidden camera in their house, watched everything unfold on his laptop. Though Lauren's words left him momentarily thoughtful, he couldn't forget what she had done to him. No matter how much she tried to justify herself, she had chosen to betray him, and now she was paying the price. The next day, James decided to continue investigating the name Thomas Santoro, the man linked to Davies' suspicious transfers. To his surprise, he discovered that Thomas was a businessman with a history of financial fraud and ties to organized crime. The connection between Davies and Thomas meant James's revenge plan was entering far more dangerous territory. While processing this information, he received an anonymous message on his phone. "Thomas knows you're behind this. If you want to stay alive, stop now." James closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the threat, but he knew he couldn't stop. His goal was closer than ever, and there was no turning back. James's plan was reaching its final stage. Every carefully moved piece was about to collapse on Davies and Lauren. Their relationship was in shambles. Daily arguments had turned into loud fights that echoed throughout the house. Davies could no longer hide his mistakes or his desperation, and Lauren, worn out, was beginning to grasp the full extent of her decisions. However, James knew that personal humiliation wasn't enough. He wanted the whole world to see Davies for what he truly was, a fraud and a traitor. One night, while watching from a building across from the company, James saw Davies hastily leave, clutching a briefcase. James decided to follow him, keeping a cautious distance, still dressed as Wilson, the beggar everyone ignored. Davies arrived at a luxury hotel, where he was greeted by a burly, stern-looking man. James immediately recognized him. Thomas Santoro, the mysterious associate financing Davies' shady dealings. James entered the hotel, blending in among the guests. From a corner of the lobby, he observed Davies handing the briefcase to Thomas, who opened it and nodded in satisfaction. Although James couldn't hear the conversation, their expressions said it all. Davies was under pressure, and Thomas was the true power behind the chaos. James recorded everything on his phone, knowing this evidence would be crucial. Meanwhile, Lauren faced her own crisis. She had received an anonymous letter containing photos of Davies with Thomas, accompanied by a note that read, "Your husband is closer to ruin than you think. Decide if you want to fall with him." Trembling, Lauren stashed the letter in a drawer, unable to decide what to do. For the first time, she felt real fear that went beyond losing her status. She knew Thomas wasn't someone to trifle with, and her intuition told her she was in danger. That night, while Davies slept on the couch after yet another argument, Lauren rummaged through his personal computer. She found emails detailing bank transfers to unknown names and messages hinting at a larger scheme than she had imagined. One email mentioned something that froze her blood. "The operation is underway. Santoro has everything ready for the closure. Make sure Lauren doesn't suspect anything." Seeing her own name in such a cold and calculated message was chilling. On the other side of the city, James decided to use the evidence he had to launch a public attack on Davies. He sent the videos and documents he had gathered to a journalist working for a major news network. The journalist, impressed by the magnitude of the material, promised to publish it the following day. James knew this would be the final blow that would destroy Davies' reputation and trigger his ultimate downfall. At dawn, while Davies desperately tried to salvage the remnants of his company, the scandal broke in the news. The headlines were ruthless: businessman accused of million-dollar fraud, and corruption exposed. The secrets of Davies Gonzalez. The report included images of Davies handing the briefcase to Thomas and emails confirming the misappropriation of funds. In his office, Davies faced absolute chaos. Shareholders called non-stop, demanding explanations, while employees abandoned the building amid rumors of mass layoffs. At that moment, Thomas called him, his icy voice cutting through the receiver. "What have you done, Davies? You said you had this under control." Davies, sweating, tried to justify himself. "This is an attack. Someone's trying to destroy me." Thomas showed no compassion. "If you drag me down with you, you'll regret it. Fix this mess before it's too late." The call ended abruptly, leaving Davies with a lump in his throat. He knew Thomas was a ruthless man, and failure wasn't an option. Meanwhile, Lauren, growing increasingly paranoid, began to suspect that Davies wasn't her only enemy. She decided to contact the private investigator she had hired weeks earlier to follow Davies. That afternoon, the investigator arrived with additional information that left her breathless. Among the photos he had taken was one of Wilson, the beggar she had seen several times near the company. The photo showed Wilson watching Davies and Thomas at the hotel. Lauren studied the image intently, feeling a strange familiarity. Although Wilson's appearance was disheveled, something in his eyes was disturbingly familiar. She recalled the night at the cafe when he had warned her about Davies. Who was this man? And, more importantly, what did he want? That night, while Davies drowned himself in alcohol, Lauren decided to confront him. She walked into the living room with the anonymous letter and the photos she had found on his computer. "How long were you planning to keep lying to me, Davies? Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Davies, exhausted, looked up with a vacant expression. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Lauren. This isn't as simple as you think." Lauren let out a bitter laugh. "Not simple? Embezzling money, working with a criminal like Thomas? And now, thanks to you, our lives are destroyed." Davies stood up, swaying slightly. "Don't act like a victim. You chose this life too. You chose to betray James with me." James's name echoed through the room like a bombshell. Lauren clenched her fists, feeling her entire life falling apart. But instead of responding, she walked out of the house, leaving Davies alone in the living room. The following day, James received an unexpected message on his phone. It was from Thomas. The message read, "See you soon, Wilson. I know who you are and what you're doing." James felt a mix of adrenaline and fear. He knew Thomas was a dangerous enemy, but he also knew this confrontation was inevitable. From the window of his small apartment, James looked out over the city as he planned his next move. His revenge was almost complete, but there were still pieces in play. Thomas wasn't just the final obstacle. He was also the most lethal. The dawn in the city heralded a day of unavoidable confrontations. Davies' downfall was underway, but James knew that one more dangerous enemy remained, Thomas Santoro. The threat this man represented was clear. His influence extended far beyond Davies' shady business deals. However, James was ready to risk it all. His revenge would not be complete until Thomas also paid for his crimes. As Wilson, James found himself in the small kitchen of the apartment he shared with Margaret. Margaret, ever perceptive, noticed his unease. "Wilson, something's bothering you. I've never seen you like this. What are you planning?" James took a deep breath, thinking carefully about how to respond without revealing his true identity. "I'm just closing some chapters of my life, Margaret. Don't worry about me." She crossed her arms, clearly unconvinced. "I know you say that to calm me down, but if you need help, you have to ask for it. I'm not going to stand by if you're in danger." James gave her a brief but sincere smile. "You're one of the few people who truly care about me, Margaret. I appreciate that more than you know." Though his words temporarily reassured her, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that Wilson was about to do something reckless. Meanwhile, Lauren, after leaving her house the previous night, headed toward the building where James lived. The photo of Wilson she had received from the private investigator lingered in her mind. She couldn't explain why, but she felt there was some connection between this man and her ex-husband. Determined to get answers, she waited outside the building, watching the entrance. Her patience paid off when she saw Wilson step outside. His disheveled appearance contrasted sharply with his confident bearing and piercing gaze. Without hesitation, she followed him at a distance. Finally, as James turned into an alley, she called out, "Wait, I need to talk to you." James turned slowly, masking his surprise with a neutral expression. "Lauren, what are you doing here?" She stared at him, trying to decipher something in his face. "I knew you were different. From the first time I saw you, I felt there was something about you that didn't fit. Now I need you to tell me the truth. Who are you really?" James didn't answer immediately. The tension hung thick in the air. Finally, he took a step closer to her. "Why does it matter? You got everything you wanted, Lauren. Why keep searching for answers?" Frustration filled her voice as she raised it. "Because I'm tired of the lies, James. Yes, I know. It's you. I don't know how or why you're hiding like this, but I know." James sighed, resigned. "If you know, then you also know why I'm doing this. You betrayed me. You destroyed me. But I won't fall alone. Davies and Thomas will pay for what they've done, and you're not exempt from that." Lauren lowered her gaze, visibly shaken. "I know I did wrong, James. I know I'm beyond forgiveness, but Davies used me. I thought he loved me, but I was just a means to get to you. Please, let me help you." James looked at her in disbelief. "Help me? After everything you did? I don't need your help, Lauren. This is something I have to finish alone." Without another word, James turned and walked away, leaving Lauren alone in the alley, full of regret and remorse. Later, James received a message from Thomas, summoning him to an abandoned warehouse. He knew it was a trap, but he couldn't pass up the opportunity to confront him. Before leaving, he left a sealed envelope with Margaret, instructing her to deliver it to the authorities if anything happened to him. At the warehouse, Thomas awaited him with two other men. The air was heavy with tension as the two locked eyes. Thomas spoke first. "You're more cunning than I thought, James, but you made a mistake challenging me." James, showing no fear, replied, "The only mistake here was your trust in Davies. You used him for your schemes, but now the whole world knows who you really are." Thomas smiled coldly. "You think a few scandals will stop me? There's always another way to survive, James. But you, on the other hand, have nothing." James stepped forward, meeting Thomas's challenge head-on. "Maybe I have nothing to lose, but that makes me more dangerous than you." At that moment, sirens echoed in the distance. Thomas glanced at his men, confused, while James wore a calculated smile. "You know, Thomas, I stopped playing fair a long time ago." Law enforcement burst into the warehouse, arresting Thomas and his men. Before being taken away, Thomas spat a final threat. "This isn't over, James. There are always more pieces on the board." James watched him being led away, feeling that although the battle was won, there were still scars left to heal. Back at the apartment, James reflected on everything that had happened. Margaret handed him the envelope he had left, unable to resist asking, "And now what, James? You've achieved what you wanted, but can you really move on?" James looked out the window, gazing at the horizon. "I don't know, Margaret, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like I can try." In the months that followed, James began rebuilding his life. He sold the few remnants of his old fortune and used the money to help people like Margaret, those forgotten by society. Although the scars of his past remained, he found renewed purpose in aiding others. Lauren, for her part, moved to a distant city, determined to start anew. Though she could never fully atone for her mistakes, she learned to live with them and sought a more genuine life. On a quiet beach, James walked barefoot, feeling the sand beneath his feet. The wind caressed his face as he watched the sunset. Though his journey had been filled with pain and betrayal, he had found something far more valuable than revenge: peace. True power doesn't lie in revenge, but in the ability to overcome pain and find purpose. James learned that while the wounds of the past can mark you, they do not define who you are. In the end, everyone has the chance to be reborn if they are willing to confront their demons and embrace a new beginning. Thank you for listening to this incredible story until the end. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We also suggest watching the video that appears on the screen so you can discover other amazing stories, because I guarantee you'll be surprised.